Hi, this is Jeremy Jansen, and I'd like to welcome you to the November 2010 issue of Reason Wizardry. So far, most of our issues have been covering technical details on different aspects of sound design, and while that's very important, there's also another area that's really important when it comes to sound design, and that's our ears. Because you need to be able to hear what you want to create in order to get there, and then translate what you hear into what you can create. So what we're going to do this month is attempt to train our ears to recognize different types of sound design. Once you're able to recognize and identify different types of sound design, you're more able to create a sound to, say, customers' specifications or your own specifications for what you need for any given track. So I realize this is a little bit different than what we've done up till now, but I certainly think it's worth a try, and as always, I welcome your feedback on this issue. Alright, so first we're going to talk about how this process is going to work. What I'm going to do is play a sound, and then I'm going to pause briefly. And at that point, you can pause the video and perhaps rewind and try to identify the synthesis technique that's being used in this sound. After that, you can start up the video, and I'll open up the patch and explain the synthesis technique and why it sounds like that. Before I play the first sound, I'm going to just apologize for the MIDI playback here. I've just sold my MIDI keyboard and I'm awaiting shipment for a new keyboard. So actually I'm using Reason 5's new computer keyboard mode to play some notes here. So there isn't much room for anything special. Okay, so here's the first sound. Let's try a lower octave. So do you recognize anything about that sound? Now's your chance to pause and perhaps rewind and hear it again. Okay, now you've had a chance to identify the sound. Let's open up the patch and have a look. This patch uses sync, and it's a very simple patch, just so I could demonstrate exactly what the core sound of sync is. Sync is typically used in very biting, metallic sounding leads. You can hear that enveloped pitch decay, which is right here, the mod envelope going to oscillator 2 pitch. Without it, all we have is a square wave. This isn't used too much on bass sounds because it just sounds a little bit too messy. It can be used with a smaller amount of modulation. It still sounds a little bit messy, so it's more typical for leads and sometimes pads or effect sounds to use sync. And now, just as a quick recap for how sync works, basically we have two oscillators here. They're synced together, as you can see, and the first oscillator is going to control the tuning of the oscillator. And the second tuning controls on the second oscillator is going to control the sync tone. That's why we're modulating the oscillator to pitch to get that sync sweep. As well, the first oscillator's waveform is completely irrelevant to the sound itself, whereas the second oscillator's waveform can change the sound. We have the bandwidth control as well, and basically, if you lower it, you're going to get a thinner synced sound. It's also a little bit cleaner though. Sometimes I like it. Okay, now we're moving on to the second sound. And I made it a little bit too easy the first time around because I showed you that we were using Thor. So now for the next sounds, I'm going to encase them in a combinator so you can't necessarily tell which synth that I'm using. So let's play back this first sound. All right, now's your chance to go back and listen again. Okay, now let's open up the sound. So it is Thor and it is FM. And this one should have been the easiest for most of you because FM just has a very distinctive sound. For me, I think it's a digital modulation sound is usually what I recognize. And also, now this might sound strange to some of you who didn't grow up with video games, but also I get a very Sega Genesis, or if you're European, I guess, Sega Mega Drive sound, because the Sega Genesis used an FM sound chip. So I played so many of those games as a kid that now when I hear FM sounds, I almost immediately identify them as something related to the Sega Genesis. Often when you hear a sound like this, perhaps your first inclination is some kind of pitch modulation. Hopefully you aren't hearing filter going on there because obviously there is no filtering. I hear some type of modulation, and what might throw you off is that it's amplitude modulation or ring modulation, as it's sometimes called. Sometimes I mistake the two, but in general, the major difference is going to be that across multiple notes, you're going to have more of an in-tune modulation using FM as opposed to AM. AM is going to be usually more chaotic and more out of control. So if you hear kind of an in control, digitally modulated sound, chances are it's going to be FM. So now let's have a look at this simple patch. As with all these patches, perhaps you're going to be able to use them as starting points for this particular synthesis technique. So this is a decent starting point for an FM patch, if that's what you want. What we've got here is two oscillators that are pretty much identical, but they're detuned. And that's what's giving a little bit of unison feeling to the patch. If they're in perfect tune, so that gives it a bit of the kind of drum and bass sound. So these two oscillators are going straight through, no filter at all, actually into filter 3, into the left and right side. And that's tied to this first control here, and I'll let you hear what that sounds like. Basically, that just controls the stereo spread of the oscillators. If we've got the mod knob in this position, we are sending out the oscillators in mono straight through the amp and then through filter 3. And if we've got it turned all the way this way, we've got the oscillators sent to either side. You can see oscillator 1 is sent to the left side, oscillator 2 to the right side, controlled by the amplitude envelope, and then also scaled by rotary 1. So that means that this modulation is active when rotary 1 is fully turned. And then simultaneously, when we fully turn rotary 1, we also turn down the amp gain right here. So when this is turned up, actually gain is completely turned down. That gets rid of the mono signal. So if we have it in this position, we've got just purely the mono signal path going through the amp. And in this position, this amp is essentially turned down to nothing, and we've got this mod matrix path set up that gives us the stereo sound. So you could use this with different sounding oscillators panned to the left and right side to get less of a unison sound and more of a stereo synth sound. Let's try something briefly here. So when they're significantly different, you'll get more of a kind of panned two synths to either side sound. Here we have our third sound. You'll notice there's a little bit of delay on there, and that's because often if we're listening to a song, perhaps trying to identify the synth sound in it, of course there's going to be effects on it. So you have to be able to kind of ignore the effects and concentrate on the core sound. All right, go back and have another listen. Okay, let's open up the patch. This time around we have Maelstrom, and the sound itself is a sawtooth, but the characteristic synthesis technique that hopefully you're able to identify is a comb filter. It's a very characteristic resonant sound, and I'm going to just play with it a little bit here so you can hopefully hear what makes it unique. Let's turn off the comb filter and just hear the saw. And one other really important control is the keyboard tracking. Now, if I turn that off, the comb filter will stay static at one frequency instead of tracking the keyboard notes that I play. So using that, you can get some interesting resonances and kind of physically modeled-esque sounds that don't sound quite right with just the regular keyboard tracking on. Now you might be thinking, why not use Thor for this? And of course, Thor has some great comb filters, and I like to use those as well. But lately I've started getting more into Maelstrom and just the quickness of programming patches. There isn't any mod matrix here, and while I love the mod matrix, sometimes just quickly being able to dial up different sounds is a lot easier using Maelstrom, and you can still get some really great sounds. Let me show you something else with this exact same comb filter technique. Let's just change from a sawtooth to, say, the pink noise. And now if I play a few notes, that doesn't sound like much, but just quickly pushing the keyboard button, so just like that, you can get a physically modeled guitar sound. And then the shift is unique to Maelstrom. Being able to shift the formants up and down is something that you can't do in Thor. Of course, it has a formant filter, but that doesn't really work exactly the same way. So between the different filter types here in Maelstrom and the formant shifting, you can create one kind of template patch and then tweak from that and get a really wide variety of different sounds. All right, time to try sound 4. Let's give it a listen. It's a little bit different in that it's more of a pad and sustained sound than what we were working with earlier. It's obviously got some release on the end, and it's a polyphonic sound. But what's going on with that pitch modulation? Is it a vibrato or a coarse or tremolo or flange, or what do you think? Go back and have a listen, and then we'll have a look at it. Okay, let's open up the combinator. And what we have is Thor, and what we have is a very, very simple patch. We've got a single analog oscillator with the pulse waveform, and an LFO is modulating that pulse width. So we've got pulse width modulation, and that's what you're hearing as far as the sustained modulation sound. We've got a little bit of delay on the LFO, and that's why it's kind of delaying off like a vibrato would, and just fading in after about 300 milliseconds. And we've also just got a low pass filter on it just to kind of take the edge off the sound. So pulse width is one of the most basic modulations, one of the easiest to use, one of the lightest on your CPU, and one of the most classic retro sounds, because many of the old synths didn't have too many modulation destinations, but many of them had pulse width modulation. Now, just to look at the basics of pulse width modulation again, what we're looking at is just the width of the pulse waveform. As you can see here, it's very narrow. Let's turn off the LFO and listen. It's very narrow down at either extreme. It's actually completely silent at 0 and 127. You'll start to hear a sound at 1. A very, very thin sound, all the way to a completely square waveform at 64. So by modulating that with an envelope or an LFO, you can get some really classic sounds, especially if you're looking at perhaps recreating string machine sounds from the 70s or virtual analog strings in general. You'll need to make use of pulse width modulation. So let's quickly create a variant of this patch, maybe something a little bit less sustained and not using the LFO for pulse width modulation, but instead using an envelope. And maybe a sub oscillator. So you should definitely be able to identify pulse width modulation, although it can be a little bit tricky when comparing it to other pitch modulations like coarse and like vibrato. Okay, here's our next sound, sound 5. You should pick up that it sounds filtered somehow, but how exactly? Sounds somewhat resonant, so there's the comb filter possibility, but we've already done the comb filter, so if you've ever taken multiple choice tests, you probably know that one's got to be out. Okay, have a listen again, and we'll move on. All right, let's open it up. This probably won't be a surprise. We're using Thor, and we're using probably my favorite synthesis technique that you may have known was coming sooner or later, which is filter FM. So we've got a sawtooth wave from the multi-oscillator that isn't actually detuned, so just a raw sawtooth wave going through a low-pass filter, and the low-pass filter is being filter FM modulated by a sine wave in oscillator 3. So what else can you pick out here from the filter FM? The first thing to show you is that this isn't keyboard tracked filter FM, and that's why it sounds somewhat resonant. The filter FM oscillator, oscillator 3, isn't keyboard tracking. That provides a more resonant sound. Let's change that while we're playing. We've got rotary 1 mapped to oscillator 3's pitch because, of course, pitch is so very important in filter FM. Only certain pitches sound good, and they're not always semitones. So to just dial up exact semitones isn't that useful. You want to be able to smoothly scroll through all possible pitches to find the correct one, like this. Typically, the better sounds are in the upper part of the spectrum. Lower down, filter FM is a little bit messy. So as before, we're going to have just a quick look inside filter FM if you forgot how it works, or just to learn a little bit more, perhaps if you didn't hear our earlier filter FM issues. So what filter FM is an audio rate modulator, in this case an oscillator, modulating the filter frequency. And we could use an LFO to do the same thing, sped up very fast, but an oscillator is nice because we can easily switch the waveform, and we have some other controls that are quite nice for changing up how filter FM sounds. So I could switch from a sine wave to something else, and we'll get a different sound here. I can even go to a pulse wave and then use pulse width modulation in conjunction with filter FM. So that's a little bit of wah effect, I'd say. Kind of an exotic wah effect. I don't think too many guitarists are using, a filter FM pedal to take care of their wah. And the filter FM amount is very important in addition to the pitch. They all interrelate. The pitch of the filter FM oscillator, the amount of modulation, and the filter frequency, and the filter resonance. They all interrelate to create the sound. Here I've got an LFO to scale this amount. And once again, that's kind of a wah sound. As we back off the resonance, most of the filter FM effect is gone. So I'd recommend using this patch as perhaps a starting point for some filter FM exploration. Okay, time for sound 6. Well, it's certainly a cool effect sound, but what synthesis technique is creating it? Let's try a different octave. We're not getting a really distinct pitch on any of these notes. Okay, go back and have a listen, and then we'll open up the combinator. All right, let's see what we've got. We've got a maelstrom here that's being run through a unison, pretty much just to throw you off. We can listen now without the unison. And we've got some amplitude modulation. As I was mentioning earlier, pretty much when you hear some metallic and discordant, chaotic sounds, especially effect sounds, retro effects, the Doctor Who type stuff, a lot of that is going to be created with ring modulation or amplitude modulation. So here we have a Juno sample, or I should say grain table, being run through filter B, which is set to an AM filter. So the filter controls are a little bit different when it's set to AM. Resonance basically controls the wet and dry mix. As you can see, when it's turned all the way to 0, we get the completely dry, unmodulated sound. And then frequency controls the pitch of the AM oscillator. So since the pitch is fixed, no matter what note you're playing, you're pretty much guaranteed chaos. So if that's what you're looking for in terms of an effect sound, then you'll easily find it. But you can also get a little bit more controlled AM sounds by turning on the keyboard parameter so that the filter tracks the keyboard. So it's still somewhat discordant, and that's because there's only very specific values that are going to create sort of more in control, in tune sounds. And if that's what you're looking for, you're going to have to sweep through the frequency values and figure out which works best for you. So let's hear again what that sounded like dry. Just going through that change, I'm thinking that perhaps if we modulated this resonance knob, you'd get quite a nice sound if LFO was sweeping it. We can't do that easily because there is no resonance destination for these LFOs, but nothing's stopping you from creating a combinator modulation that's routed to the resonance knob and then sending a CV signal to that, perhaps from Thor or a sequencer or whatever you'd like. As well, I'll save this in tune AM sound as a variant on Sound 6 for you to try. All right, we've made it to Sound 7, and I'm not going to lie, this one is pretty difficult. Let's give it a listen. Well, it's an evolving sound, we know that. It seems to be going through some harmonics. What kind of synthesis is capable of that? Perhaps FM? Well, once again, like a multiple choice test, you can probably bet against FM since we've already looked at it. So I'll stop there and let you listen again, and then we'll have a look at it. Okay, let's open it up. We've got Thor and we've got a reverb. Let's open up Thor. And it's a wavetable sound. Yes, you might be able to come up with something like this using FM and different harmonics, different values for the FM pair oscillator. But when you get a sound that's evolving like this in kind of a predictable way and a very smooth way, your first thought is that it's something digital. It should be something digital in terms of a sample. Now, in Reason, it could be grain table synthesis in Maelstrom, but probably it's going to be the wavetable oscillator in Thor. And here, you can see that the wavetable I've chosen is actually different harmonics. So as we're sweeping through those harmonics by using a mod envelope, of course, you can hear each one in turn with a long decay. So more complex sounds are almost always easier to create when you've got some kind of complex and rich source sound like a wavetable as opposed to just a raw square saw sine oscillator. No matter what kind of modulations and filter permutations you put a raw oscillator through, it's going to take a ton more work and probably won't sound as smooth as a really well-created wavetable like these are. So moving on from the wavetable, I also kind of confused the issue by running the oscillator through two different parallel filters just for something interesting. And these are two bandpass filters that are tuned to different frequencies. And I've also reused that idea from Sound 1 in terms of spreading sounds across the stereo spectrum. We've got pretty much the same setup here in the mod matrix that allows us to use rotary 1 to pan filter 1 and filter 2 left and right. So let's hear how that sounds. It's somewhat subtle, but the more you change the filter frequencies and filter settings, the more overt you're going to hear the filter panning. I've also got Mod 2 set up to change the envelope shape, and that's this line right here in the mod matrix. And If you turn it up, you'll hear a difference in the envelope shape. It's tough to describe. It sounds like it's just faster, but it's actually changing the shape. I don't think I've talked about this before, but what's going on here is actually recursive modulation. And what I'm doing is using the mod envelope to modify its own decay value. And what that does is change the shape of the envelope to from a mostly linear shape to more convex. I hope I got that right. Convex shape. So it slopes more quickly. Essentially, with a setting like this, you'll get a punchier envelope. It's useful for basses, uh, anything where you want to have a really quick, punchy, analog-like envelope. In this case, I just put it in so that you could hear some differences in the harmonics as you change the shape of the envelope. Of course, I just randomly chose a wavetable. I'm not going to talk too much about wavetables here because it's pretty self-explanatory. Uh, a wavetable is just a series of waves, and you can scroll through the position using this knob. So I could have used any wavetable, and it's really quick and easy to get great results from it, especially if you spend a little bit of extra time on filtering the wavetable after, as I've done. Okay, I'm going to save this bell variant for you to try as well. Okay, we're on to sound 8. Let's hear what it sounds like. All right, well, it's quite realistic. Definitely has that realistic orchestra sound. We've kind of already looked at comb filters, so that might be your first choice. All right, I'll pause there. Okay, I'm going to open up this combinator. And as you can see, this is the obligatory trick question. This is a sample. So I'm showing you this so that you remember that perhaps when you're listening to a track and you really like one sound or one aspect of that track and are having trouble figuring out how to synthesize something like it, well, remember that a lot of the times in a lot of tracks that we listen to, especially popular tracks, there's a ton of samples used. And even something that sounds like it's synthesized may have been sampled and processed through a whole mess of different configurations, and it could be next to impossible to recreate something like it. And the other lesson is, though sometimes you may want to, say, synthesize an orchestral sound and try your best at getting something realistic, sometimes it's just best to use a sample. It really depends on what you want, but you have to consider whether the time is worth it to create something that sounds realistic, and whether you might not just be better served using a sample that gets you there instantly. So if you hear some really incredible bell tone in a song and just can't for the life of you figure out how to create it, even with, say, Thor's wavetable oscillators, well, maybe you could just grab a microphone and find a really nice sounding bell in real life and record it using Reason 5 sampling. All right, so we're going to do 10 total sounds. So there's two more. This is sound 9. Let's listen. Well, it's certainly filtered. Sounds really good. A lot of stereo space in it as well. Is that a unison effect or a chorus, or? There's definitely multiple waveforms at work. Okay, I'll pause there, see if you can figure out any more about it. And now I'll continue. So we've actually got two Thor patches here, and they're being played essentially in unison, going through one mixer device and then into the combinator. So we'll just open up one of them and have a look. What we've got here is basically the modern virtual analog synthesis technique. We're using the multi-oscillators slightly detuned, and we're also spreading them across the octaves with one sub-oscillator and one oscillator higher. They're all running through one 12 dB low-pass filter. So this is a very typical sound, something you're going to hear a lot, and you're probably pretty good at identifying these types of sounds already. What is more difficult is determining the details of the sound. When you listen to this, hopefully you can pick out that that high sound isn't a sawtooth, and indeed it is a pulse up there. Listening to multiple oscillators of different shapes and coming up with what shapes they are is one of the most difficult aspects of training your ear for sound design. So I've used a 12 dB filter because that's most typical in these types of sounds. A lot of these modern trance kind of dance pads, detuned pads, are using 12 dB filters on synths like, Roland's JP8080, I believe that's it, with the super saw waveform, and the Virus and countless other modern synths use a 12 dB filter for most of these sounds. So I probably don't have to go much more into detail here. We've got some envelope modulation from the filter envelope. And we've got a little bit of resonance, which you can kind of tune to your taste. Of course, we're only changing one side of the stereo spectrum because we've got one Thor in channel 1 and one Thor in the second channel, and they're both panned hard left and right. And the reason I've done that is because a lot of times we'll take a shortcut and use a unison device, but if we'd actually double the devices, or maybe even more than that, use 4 Thor devices, pan them across the stereo spectrum, and slightly detune them, as I've done here, you'll get more of a true unison sound. Yes, it's much heavier on your CPU, and it makes it more difficult to tweak each sound because, of course, now if I want to go in and make a change, I have to make a near identical change on both Thor devices, but in the end, I feel the sound quality is quite a bit better. So here's a good starting point for working with some modern virtual analog synthesis. All right, we've reached sound 10 and our last sound for this November issue. Let's have a listen. Okay, well, right off it's sequenced and it's quite complex. There's a bit of grittiness there. Okay, I realize this one is pretty difficult, but try your best, think what might be in this patch, and then we'll open it up. All right, so, this patch has a name. It's called FM Sacrifice, and that clues you in on the patch. And it's also because this is a outtake from Pantheon. Never quite finished this patch, and it's going to be yours now, but we can also have a look at it and figure out what's going on. So there's a lot going on. This is much more complex than any patch we looked at so far. We've got 3 FM oscillators. You can see right away that we're only actually hearing the first one, which is a fairly simple 1-in-1 carrier modulator module. So what have we got going on below? Oscillator 2 is purely here to FM modulate the first filter, and oscillator 3 is here to FM modulate the first oscillator. So we've got both filter FM and oscillator FM going on. You can see them right here. Here's the filter FM, and here's the oscillator FM. In addition, there's an LFO that is changing the FM value of oscillator 3. So you've got kind of multiple oscillator FM coming in from different angles. We've also got 2 filters, but as you can see here, this filter has got a full frequency and no resonance, no modulations really going on. So why do we need that? And what I've done here is used filter 2 as kind of a dry signal path. There's nothing happening here. So what I'm doing is using the filter drive as a modulation so I can control the wet and dry mix. So if I turn down this wet mix, we're going to have just the sound coming through here. And that's essentially a completely dry, unfiltered sound. So that's you should hopefully be picking out that that's very oscillator FM. Now we can get rid of that completely and just listen to this filter 1 mix. So that's gritty, and hopefully you're picking out that gritty high end and somewhat that formant wah effect and associating that with filter FM. So by mixing those two together, you've got, frankly, a fairly good patch. So play around with this one, enjoy it, and I'd recommend adding some modulations to the combinator here, perhaps some FM frequency control for the filter FM, some maybe filter frequency control, maybe some amounts of filter FM, or whatever you like. So that completes this November 2010 issue. I know it was a little bit different this time around. I hope you enjoyed a new approach. Hopefully it was something fresh and interesting. As always, I'm looking for your feedback and your suggestions for future issues. So shoot me off an email and let me know what you think. Until next time, I'm Jeremy Jansen. Cheers.